Welcome to a deep dive into, well, this is pretty cool. It's the Indigenous Peoples Rights Act of 1997 from the Philippines. We're going to be taking you on a journey kind of through history and justice and cultural identity, and hopefully you'll find it as fascinating as we do.
Absolutely. And I think what's so interesting about this act is it's not just some, dusty old legal document. It's really a living example of a nation grappling with its past and trying to figure out how to empower its indigenous communities in the present.
Okay, yeah, now you've got me intrigued. But how do we even begin to unpack something as complex as an entire act? I mean, where do we even start?
Well, I think a great place to start is with who this act aims to protect, and that's the Indigenous Cultural Communities, Indigenous Peoples, or ICCSIPs, as they're referred to in the act. And one of the first things this act does is it actually redefines what it means to belong to these communities.
Redefine. So it's more than just like checking a box on a census form.
Oh, way more. It goes beyond these really simple definitions based on like bloodlines or how much you look a certain way. It digs into the very heart of identity, and it does that by highlighting four key elements. So we've got self-identification, a shared territory, a distinct culture, and maybe even most importantly, a shared historical experience.
So it's recognizing these deep connections that these communities have to their land, their culture, and their past.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where things start to get really interesting because this is where the act kind of turns the traditional ways we think about land ownership on its head, especially when it comes to something called ancestral domain.
Ancestral domain. Okay, that sounds serious. What exactly are we talking about here?
This is where the act really takes a different approach because it says that for many indigenous communities, their relationship with their land, it isn't just about, legal documents or even how long they've lived there. It goes back generations, centuries even, to what the act refers to as time immemorial.
Time immemorial. Okay, now that's just cool. It's like we've been here since forever, long before anyone was keeping track. That's amazing.
It is. It's acknowledging a connection that runs deeper than any deed or title ever could. And this completely changes how we approach their rights.
All right, so you say this changes how we think about rights. So what specific rights does the Act actually give to Indigenous communities when it comes to their ancestral domains? What does that look like?
Well, first and foremost, it recognizes their inherent and inalienable right to own, possess, and use their lands and waters.
So it's not just acknowledging their history, it's giving them real legal power over their lands today.
Exactly. This means they have the right to develop their resources to use them, but, and this is a big but, the Act really emphasizes sustainability and responsibility for future generations. It recognizes that Indigenous communities have this unique and very valuable perspective on environmental stewardship.
So it's about finding a balance between their needs now and the well-being of, their children, their grandchildren. It's about respecting their traditions and their knowledge when it comes to caring for the land.
Exactly. And it's not just about protecting what they already have. The Act goes even further by granting them the right to benefit from any resources found within their domains.
Even if those resources are discovered in the future.
Yes, even resources that are discovered in the future.
Wow, that's huge. It's like saying what's found on your land is yours,
Yeah.
and you deserve a say in how it's used. That's a big change from how things have often worked, historically.
Absolutely. And this focus on self-determination extends to who can even enter their territories. So the Act grants Indigenous communities the right to control migration into their ancestral domains.
That's a pretty powerful statement, right? It's about recognizing their right to kind of maintain their cultural and social structures.
Exactly. It's about giving them the power to say, this is our home and we get to decide who shares it with us. And speaking of protecting their home, the Act guarantees their right to stay in their territories.
So no more instances of Indigenous communities being displaced from their ancestral lands.
That's the idea. The Act recognizes the incredibly devastating impact that forced relocations have had on Indigenous communities, both culturally and spiritually.
It really is remarkable, trying to right those historical wrongs. But you were saying that it goes even further than that.
Right, it does, because it's not always as simple as just saying, okay, you can stay on your land. Sometimes, things happen.
Yeah, of course. Life happens. So what about those situations where, like, relocation might be unavoidable? Let's say a natural disaster, something like that.
Exactly. Those are like the curveballs that you can't always plan for, right? But the Act addresses this as well. It mandates that if relocation ever becomes absolutely necessary, the government has to step in and really make things right.
Okay, so how do they do that? What does that actually look like?
Well, for starters, they have to find suitable areas to resettle the communities, and not just any areas, but places that are, comparable to what they had before. They have to provide essential services, support their livelihoods, and this part is really critical. It grants them the right to return to their land once it's safe.
So it's about ensuring their well-being, even when faced with these really challenging circumstances. What if returning just isn't possible, though? I mean, some things you just can't undo. What happens then?
Even in those cases, the Act emphasizes that they must be provided with land that's comparable, both in terms of quality and legal standing to what they had before. It's about minimizing that disruption to their lives and cultural continuity as much as possible.
It's like the act is saying, we're going to exhaust every option to make sure you're not worse off because of something, something you had no control over.
Yeah, exactly.
There's another aspect of this act I find really fascinating. It's the right of indigenous communities to resolve conflicts according to their own, like, customary laws. That's a big deal, isn't it?
It really is. It's a huge departure from, like, your typical legal proceedings and a really powerful recognition of their own justice systems.
So it's not just about land, it's about recognizing their right to self-governance, to,
Yeah.
like, manage their own affairs in a way that aligns with, their traditions and beliefs.
Yes, exactly. This act isn't just about saying, here's some land, don't get us wrong. It's about empowering them to govern themselves, to preserve their identities. And speaking of self-governance, Chapter 4 tackles this head-on.
Okay, Chapter 4, self-governance. Let's dig in. What's the heart of it?
Well, it all comes back to self-determination. It's their right. And in practice, this means recognizing their right to establish and maintain their own indigenous political structures. So think, participating in decision-making at all levels of government.
So having their voices heard not just within their communities, but like on the national stage too, making sure their concerns are taken seriously.
That's right. It encourages their involvement in shaping the policies that directly affect them, aiming for a real partnership rather than like a top-down approach.
Recognizing them as equal stakeholders in the future of their nation.
Yeah.
And I think it even specifically mentions support for autonomous regions, right?
Yes. It acknowledges the existing ones like we see in Muslim Mindanao and the Cordillera, and it encourages other ICCs and IPs to consider this model if they want to.
Which makes sense, right? One size fits all doesn't work in a country as diverse as the Philippines.
Yeah.
Each community, each region is going to have its own unique, needs and wants.
Right. And this respect for that diversity extends beyond just political structures, too. Remember how we were talking about the use of customary laws in, like, land disputes? Well, that same principle, it applies more broadly. The Act recognizes their right to use their own justice systems and peace-building processes as long as they align with, those basic fundamental human rights.
It's recognizing that what matters most is that it's fair and culturally relevant.
Exactly. And this whole idea of cultural integrity, it's not just confined to legal matters, it's woven throughout this entire Act.
And speaking of that, I mean, Chapter 6 is entirely dedicated to cultural integrity. It's clear that this act gets it. It understands the importance of protecting not just the land, but the incredibly rich cultures of the indigenous communities in the Philippines.
And it really does take a multifaceted approach to doing that, too.
So how so? What does that look like?
Well, education is one key area. It includes provisions for indigenous communities to, like, establish and control their own education systems.
Oh, wow. So rather than being forced to, like, assimilate into a mainstream system that might not reflect their values, they have the right to teach their own languages, their own histories, their own, like, ways of seeing the world.
Exactly. It's all about empowerment. And that's not to say there shouldn't be any interaction. The Act mandates that even the national education system has to be sensitive to their cultural methods of teaching and learning.
Fostering mutual understanding, respect, it's great.
Yeah, and this commitment to preserving their culture, it extends beyond the classroom, too. The Act safeguards their rights to their religious and cultural sites, ceremonies, even the use of ceremonial objects.
It's recognizing that these things hold deep spiritual significance.
Right.
And I noticed it even mentions the repatriation of human remains, which, wow, that speaks volumes about respecting their ancestors and traditions.
Yeah, for sure. And to your point, it specifically prohibits any kind of unauthorized digging or excavation of archaeological sites.
Again, recognizing the deep meaning and the importance of those places to these communities.
Right. It's about protecting their heritage from exploitation. Any research, any study has to be done with their full consent and participation.
It's really quite remarkable. It's like they thought of everything From like passing down knowledge to protecting these sacred sites, this act tries to safeguard their heritage from every angle.
It really does. And there's even this incredibly forward-thinking element, recognizing community intellectual rights.
Now, that's a new one. I'm not familiar with that. Community intellectual rights. What does that even mean?
It basically acknowledges that indigenous communities, they're the rightful owners, the custodians of their traditional knowledge. So we're talking, cultural expressions, even genetic resources. It makes sure they have control over how these things are used, how they're shared.
So traditional medicines, ways of farming, designs, music, stories, all of that is protected.
That's the idea. And keep in mind, this was 1997. Pretty cutting edge for the time. It has huge implications for things like, biopiracy and cultural appropriation, making sure these communities have a say in how their knowledge and their resources are utilized, and importantly, that they benefit from them.
It's recognizing that their cultures are valuable and deserve to be protected. It's clear that this act is about so much more than just acknowledging that these communities exist. It's about creating a system to protect their rights and their well-being.
And that includes their fundamental rights as citizens of the Philippines. I mean, remember, this whole act is grounded in the principle of social justice. It wants to make sure everyone, regardless of their background, has an equal opportunity to thrive.
Okay, so that brings us to Chapter 5, right? Social justice and human rights. What kind of protections are we talking about here?
So this chapter, it really hammers home the point that Indigenous peoples should have the same rights and opportunities as every other Filipino citizen.
No one should be left behind.
Exactly. And it specifically says no discrimination based on their ethnicity. It affirms their right to equal access to things like employment, education, healthcare.
So making sure they have the same opportunities, not just within their own communities, but in Filipino society as a whole.
Right, breaking down those barriers. And it acknowledges that, unfortunately, historical injustices, they've often led to, systemic disadvantages. So it's trying to level the playing field.
In what ways? What are some of the ways it tries to do that?
Well, for example, it mandates equal pay for equal work. No matter your ethnicity, you do the same work, you get the same pay. It also protects Indigenous people from things like coercive recruitment or exploitative working conditions.
Which is essential, especially given, the history we've been discussing.
For sure. And again, it goes beyond these general principles. It gets specific and highlights the need to address the unique needs of Indigenous women, children, and youth.
I was hoping it would address those specific needs. Too often, women, children, youth, they get overlooked, especially within marginalized communities. So what does that look like? How does it address those specific needs?
Well, for women, it really stresses equal rights and opportunities in every single aspect of life, including leadership roles and decision-making, full access to education, healthcare, economic opportunities. And it recognizes that they have specific needs when it comes to things like, maternal care and protection from violence.
Their voices are so important. Their experiences are so important to creating truly inclusive communities. What about children and youth?
For them, the Act focuses on access to culturally appropriate education, and of course, protection from exploitation and abuse.
It's about making sure they have every opportunity, every resource they need to really thrive and become the next generation of leaders and change makers. This act, it's honestly amazing, so comprehensive. But laws, even the best ones, they don't enforce themselves. So how do we make sure that all of these rights that we've been discussing, how do we make sure they're actually put into practice? What's the mechanism for that?
Well, that is the million-dollar question, right? And that's where the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples comes in, the NCIP.
The NCIP. Okay.
Yeah, you can think of them as the guardians of this act. They're the ones working to make sure it's actually implemented effectively and that all these promises, they actually translate into, tangible change.
So they're kind of like the bridge between these communities and the government, making sure those voices are heard, that their rights are being respected at every level.
Exactly. And they've got some real power, too. I mean, they're the ones issuing the certificates of ancestral domain title, the CATs.
Which are, sorry, remind me.
Oh, right. So those CADTs, those are the documents that officially recognize the ownership rights of Indigenous communities to their ancestral lands.
Okay, so like the legal proof, the security of those rights. Got it.
Yes, exactly. But it's not just about, pushing paper around. The NCIP, they also have this really important role in helping to resolve disputes. They coordinate on development projects, advocate for these communities' rights at every level of government.
Wow, so they're like professional multitaskers. That's a huge job, trying to balance all of those different needs and perspectives and make sure that, the heart of this act is actually being honored.
Absolutely. It is a huge undertaking. And it's important to acknowledge, I think, that implementing something this comprehensive, it's going to have its challenges. There are always going to be roadblocks and complexities, even resistance, right?
Because changing laws on paper, that's one thing. But
Yeah.
changing like mindsets and practices, these ingrained power structures, that's a whole different story.
100%. And that's actually something I want to leave you with as we wrap up this deep dive. How effective has this act really been in the years since it was passed? What kind of progress have we seen? What are the challenges that still remain? It's something to think about.
Yeah. It's a good point. It's a good question. Well, we've really dug into some fascinating territory today, haven't we? We've explored these core ideas of, ancestral domains, self-governance, cultural protection, and social justice. It's honestly inspiring to see a nation really trying to reconcile with its past and create a future where everyone has a chance to thrive.
It really is. And I think this act, it's a great case study, really, for anyone interested in Indigenous rights, land rights, cultural preservation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because this act, it begs the question, how can legal systems truly reflect and respect the incredible diversity of the people and cultures they're meant to serve?
That's the question.
And a good one to ponder, I think, as we conclude our deep dive.
Right.
We hope you've gained some new insights into this really important piece of legislation. It's complex, it's nuanced, but it's deeply, deeply impactful.